Well, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us at Shell today for the launch of our latest scenarios. My name is Nick Ravenscroft. I'm a former journalist, but I now work at Shell. And today, my job is to put your questions to our head of scenarios, and that's Jeremy Bentham, who joins us here. Jeremy's scenarios team is a group of energy experts, political analysts, economists, and all-round big thinkers. And at Shell, we like to think of them as future gazers. So they're not predicting the future, but what they are doing is exploring the different possible versions of what that future might be. And in the context of climate change, they've been, in the last few months, looking around the corners of our route to a low carbon future and trying to anticipate all the possible bumps in all the possible roads which could lead us to those goals in the Paris Agreement. Now, we've been producing scenarios at Shell for half a century, but I think it's fair to say that these ones are particularly significant. Jeremy has prepared a short presentation. It's 15 or 20 minutes, just to give you the overall shape of what these scenarios are that we're launching today. But after that, it's your questions. And if you'd like to submit a question, it's very easy to do that. Look at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and you'll see a yellow question bar. Now, we'd encourage you very much to start submitting those questions during Jeremy's video, and you can continue doing so throughout the question and answer session. But we're about to play that video now. Please, when it's finished, just sit tight, because it may be just a few moments before Jeremy and I come back on screen.
Hello, I'm Jeremy and I'm privileged to lead the Shell Scenarios team. I'm also privileged to have this opportunity to share a few perspectives with you, so thank you for that. Our job is to help people make wiser decisions about the future in the face of inevitable uncertainties. We try to help decisions become more resilient and more effective by stretching thinking and also focusing it. And we've been doing this for about 50 years in the company. Now, we all know the future isn't predictable in detail, but neither is it completely random. You can think systematically and apply rigorous analysis to the consequences of different developments. And that sort of insight is really valuable, particularly in times like these, which are turbulent and complex. Let's face it, the pandemic is a global crisis. The recession is a global crisis. And yet we still have to make choices. We still have decisions to make. And in fact, the English word crisis derives from the Greek word crisis, meaning decisions. Decisions that open up doors to new futures, new ways of thinking. Choices that may ultimately transform the global economy and the global energy system. So I'm hoping to introduce three different ways the future might unfold. And these are born out of three different approaches to recovery from the current circumstances. Different priorities in the mix. We found that there are three main priorities that are top of mind for most people. There's economic recovery. There's the recovery of a sense of security, and there's also recovery in well-being, in public health. And everybody, all people in all societies will be seeking all three objectives, and yet different circumstances and different values may lead to different balances in the mix of the way things go forward in different places. Let me briefly outline how each of the three scenarios plays out. In our waves scenario, the dominant priority is to repair the economy. Wealth first. Self-interest is perceived in terms of material prosperity, resilience in terms of economic strength. Because of this focus, economic recovery is relatively rapid, but comes at the cost of multiple spikes in infections. We can think of these as waves. On the surface, there is an upswelling in economic growth, leading to a surge in the need for energy and fossil fuels, and of course then greenhouse gas emissions. But there are underlying currents that eventually lead to these waves crashing down. Apparent economic success disguises more deeper issues. Inequality grows in the world and within individual economies. People who were hailed as key workers, as heroes in the crisis, still find themselves in precarious and low-income positions. Social discontent grows as a result of this, and labour unrest. And also, the public begins to react to more frequent and extreme weather events. The blame for these societal and environmental pressures is placed on the lack of previous action to structural issues like social welfare, like public health, like climate change. So there's a political and social backlash. From an energy perspective, this backlash comes in the form of knee-jerk, rapid policy reductions in the use of fossil fuels. So having grown, coal and oil demand peaks in the 2030s, and natural gas soon afterwards. Then there is rapid policy-driven decline. This means that while in this scenario it's been late to give serious attention to decarbonisation of the economy, once it's given, it moves extremely quickly. We're in late but fast decarbonisation. But because it's late, it means that the growth in greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere outstrips what is required to meet the stretch goals of the Paris Agreement. So by the end of the century, global temperature rise is about 2.3 degrees above pre-industrial average, in contrast to the 1.5 degrees centigrade of the Paris stretched ambition. The world has to learn to live with those consequences. All right, let me take you into a different place now. Let me describe an alternative scenario, our islands outlook. Now, in islands, the dominant priority is near-term recovery at home. It's security first. Resilience is understood in terms of autonomy and self-sufficiency. You can think of this as an islands mentality, a focus at the close to home, the near at hand. So these internally focused efforts have mixed results. Some countries do quite well, but others fall behind. Poor policy decisions are made. Political legitimacy is questioned. As nationalism takes hold, there are frictions in international collaboration and international trade. So the economy globally begins to stagnate. In particular, the Paris process for addressing climate change unravels. Nations that are focused on short-term economic outcomes remain dependent on the type of cheap fossil fuels that can fuel their local economy. So global emissions decline only slowly. So of course, more frequent weather events eventually cause disruptions, they cause damage, but blame is placed on others, not absorbed into the domestic politics. Still, technology improvements still ratchet forwards, partly driven by those countries that see an advantage within that. And this makes cleaner technologies cheaper, so adoption continues more broadly. But this trend is too slow to meet the Paris ambitions. We're in a slow and late decarbonisation scenario. By the end of the century, the global temperature rise is 2.5 degrees and still rising slowly. Let me take you now into a third world. Let's look at what happens if that third priority of health and well-being emerges strongly. In Sky 1.5, these become the dominant priorities. Think of navigating through the sky, through storm clouds, assisted by a confluence of favourable winds. So after a slow start in opening the economy, people begin to recognise the value of alignments, whether those alignments are intentional or unintentional. People recognise the value of the collaborative efforts and the healthy competition there has been between international scientific and medical communities in developing vaccines and approaches to treating people. And those lessons get absorbed more broadly. So from public health alone, there's an evolution towards attention to well-being more broadly, well-being of people, the economy, and the whole planet. Resilience is understood in terms of reforming and strengthening those systems and institutions and approaches that have been exposed as being weak by the crisis. From an energy perspective, people learn from the success of green policies and green developments, not only in terms of reducing emissions and protecting the environment, but in terms of creating jobs. And so there is steady recovery in the economy as well. And most significantly, there's a push for national, domestic, and industrial competitiveness around the world. Nations like the United States and China and technology-focused economies elsewhere in Europe and in Asia focus on the clean technology arena as an area to build economic success and dominance. A competitive race breaks out amongst those cleaner technology developments. What you see is rapid and deep electrification of the whole economy, dominated by growth in the use of renewables like solar and wind. So coal and oil, demand for those peak in the 2020s, with natural gas in the 2030s to early 2040s. And then they go into rapid decline in consumption as cleaner technologies are being able to be applied by end users. Liquid and gaseous fuels, however, still remain essential in those parts of the economy that are harder to electrify. Overall, this enables the leading economies to meet goals of net zero emissions by 2050. And overall, the temperature rise is slightly above, but then limited to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, in line with the stretched Paris Agreement. So, these have just been a few highlights from our Waves, Islands and Sky 1.5 scenarios, and you can find out much more detail if you look in the publications. But what can we conclude? What are the lessons? Well, from an energy point of view, there are common threads. Although the pace of development of these things is different across the scenarios. Let me point to 5 different things. First, there's significant development in the efficiency of energy use. And there is growth in the consumption of energy as population grows globally and material prosperity continues to spread. From an efficiency point of view, there's almost a doubling of the energy service efficiency over the century, meeting in some cases technological limits. And from a consumption point of view, this helps limit overall growth to between 30 and 80% over the century. Second, there is significant and deep electrification of the economy, driven by the availability of solar, wind, and other renewable resources. So from today's position of about 20% of end-use energy being supplied by electricity, you move to as much as 60% over the course of the century. Third, in those sectors that are hard to electrify, there is still a need for energy-dense, portable, thermal, liquid and gaseous fuels, but these progressively decarbonize through the use of biofuels and hydrogen-based carriers. Fourth, demand for crude oil and natural gas is likely to peak in the next couple of decades and then decline. But that pace of decline will not be as fast as the underlying rate of depletion from producing reservoirs. So you'll still need investment into those areas to meet the changing demand for liquid and gaseous fuels. And then finally, number 5, all three scenarios see some mix of the need for emissions removal from the atmosphere, whether technologically through carbon capture and storage, or naturally through reforestation and so other nature solutions. So, ultimately, what societies choose during this crisis is going to push towards one type of the scenario or another. And those outlooks will be attractive for some people and challenging for others. However, because almost everyone will benefit from avoiding the type of impacts and risks of climate change, then over the long term, it's in the interests of most people to have a more accelerated decarbonisation, similar to what is described in Sky 1.5. So, just perhaps, it's possible for us to step forward and grasp another lesson. We know that achieving Sky 1.5 will be extremely challenging, but it is still technologically and macroeconomically possible. And history has shown that particular actions can accelerate progress. Think of it, 30 years ago, it seemed unrealistic to be thinking of a decarbonised power system or decarbonised passenger transport. But now we see that solar and wind can provide large-scale power at net zero emissions, and passenger vehicles can be electrified using that decarbonised power. So how did this come about? From being unrealistic 30 years ago to being seemingly straightforward now? Well, progress has its roots in crises. The oil price spikes in the 1970s and in the early 2000s. In the Fukushima nuclear disaster, in the financial crises in Asia in the mid-90s and globally in the mid to late 2000s. All these brought considerable change and got the ball rolling. And we have to hope that this can be the case again today. What then happened is, from these crises, you had critical alignments of key players. For example, in California, you had the bringing together of smart policies and incentives from governments supported by businesses and critically also consumers to bring forward the development and deployment of electric vehicles at scale. It required pioneer governments and pioneer companies to anchor those initial alignments, which then grew. And just as with electric vehicles, the same was true in the growing deployment of solar and wind and other renewable power that we've seen around the world. Crises leading to alignments underpinned by smart policy and then driven by pioneer companies and governments initially. So, as we take a big perspective, Waves, Islands and Sky 1.5 show different ways the world could unfold. Some with paths that miss the Paris Agreement objectives, but also a way to succeed. Whether we succeed or not depends on the choices that we're making today, how everyone responds to the crisis. You see, there's a special thing about humanity. People have the capacity to learn from each other, but also to learn the lessons of the past. Constructive reactions can help build alignments, encourage smart policies, and inspire pioneering leaders. So even though the pace of change is undoubtedly challenging, it's still possible if society accelerates decisively. History has shown that shocks can galvanize people into action. I hope this will be the case right now. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, now we've come to the part of the webinar where it's your questions being put to Jeremy, and we've already got some pretty interesting ones, but please do carry on submitting your questions. Just a reminder of the way to do that. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a yellow question bar. So get your questions in now. We want to have as many as possible and pick the best ones and have an opportunity to discuss them. So, Jeremy, congratulations. It's a really rich and textured piece of work. During the research and the analysis, I wonder, was there anything that really surprised you or confounded your expectations?
Oh, thank you for the question. Yes, I think so, because the work initially was confirming the kind of technological outlooks that we published back in 2016 with A Better Life with a Healthy Planet, and also the necessary pace of change in Sky scenario from 2018. But indeed, in looking at how you could get the system to work, to get going more quickly along a Sky-type route, that lesson of crises as being a route that galvanizes people into action and can bring those alignments, smart policies about recovery, and also the stepping up of particular pioneer leaders was wonderful to understand better in history and to recognize that that could happen again.
All of the outlooks anticipate that in the next decades, the world is going to use more energy than now. But some people insist that there are going to be energy efficiency improvements that are going to reduce the need for energy. So, how does that work out? What about energy efficiency putting a dent in energy demand?
I think you saw from some of the charts that energy efficiency is incredibly significant and has a huge impact on moderating demand. And indeed, there's plenty of scope for energy efficiency. If we look, for instance, at a mature industrialized economy, such as in North America, you're using there about 300 gigajoules per person per year of energy, whereas in similarly, mature economies such as Europe and Japan are using about 150. So it's actually the structure of the economy and the structure of the urban environment that has a big impact, as well as end use efficiencies. So we study carefully each sector, think about how end use efficiency could continue to progress, such as with the transfer from old-fashioned lighting into LED lighting, but also things like urban policy and how that can make much more compact, integrated urban developments. There are lots of different factors to take into account in assessing overall efficiency. At the same time, you've got a century which from now will probably see a 40% increase in global population and the need of spreading prosperity more widely in the world. So the pressures on the need for energy services are very, very strong as well.
So look, we've got one comment which has come in from a viewer, which I'd like to get your thoughts on, Jeremy. And this viewer says that waves and islands sound plausible, just reading the text here. Sky 1.5 seems more aspirational. It goes on, I can imagine that we'll see all three scenarios unfolding simultaneously in the world, but countries will choose to go one route or another, and they might change that route in line with the political cycles. So it could be a lot more messy and therefore could lead to an even poorer outcome. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it will be turbulent because indeed you are seeing the evidence of choices that you can match against each scenario currently, and that's one of the reasons why we develop scenarios to help understand what the boundaries of possibilities are, what the choices that we as a company need to make need to be in those circumstances. But indeed, each of the scenarios is plausible, with Sky 1.5 also having the aspiration, a target of reaching the goals of the stretched Paris Agreement. What I would say is that when we published Sky in 2018, my big question is what could get that accelerated decarbonisation going? And what we've seen is between 2018 and 2020, the world wasn't moving at the pace necessary for Sky. However, we have been through a very troubling crisis, and that lesson that crises can create the circumstances for accelerating change have actually, for me, made Sky 1.5 more plausible now than it would have been if we published it in 2018.
So a terrible 12 months, but a silver lining. Okay, that's interesting. We've got more comments coming in. Anybody watching, please continue to submit questions. Bottom right-hand corner of your screen, it's the yellow question bar. The next one for you, Jeremy. One of our viewers asks, both 2.3 and 2.5 degrees seem low given the stories in waves and islands. Could waves lead to new innovations in energy production and green tech, and therefore to a rapid decarbonisation?
Well, I think you'll see in waves that it is a very, very fast decarbonisation once it gets going. Partly that's because it takes another decade, a decade and a half to get going, and there's more time then for the kinds of innovative developments to progress further as well. So that's significant that innovation continues in all scenarios. But of course, innovation isn't just about pure science. It's about the innovative policies required to deploy those more broadly. So there's a lot of facets within that. And something else that is useful, I think, for people to recognize is simply the scale of the energy system. So we've done previous research that was published in Nature that shows that typically, even when something takes off rapidly because it's commercially and technically possible, and may be growing at 25% globally per year, which is a huge pace of growth. Even with that growth rate, it takes 30 years for something to meet 1% of global energy needs because of the simple size of the system. So there are time scales in big infrastructures and in big systems like the energy system that mean fast is 2 to 3 decades is very, very fast.
Excellent. So look, we're getting questions more about the political context. This is a recurring theme, unsurprisingly. Next question, Jeremy. What is the role of and how effective is government in catalyzing these different scenarios? Do you envisage technology evolving faster than government can respond and thus democratizing progress?
It's a complicated two-part question, so I'll start at the beginning, and maybe you need to come back for the second part there. Just a reminder for folks that some folks will go into a breakout room after this presentation and be able to talk to some of our political and economic specialists as well there. What we've found is governments play a very, very important role. Not in isolation, of course, because they are also responding to the inputs from the rest of society, from civilians, from citizens, from businesses. But you see the pattern that frames for policy are created by government that businesses and citizens respond to. And so there is an iterative process that goes on there, but it's very important to have those frames. So, for example, in the initial development of cleaner technologies, it's important to be investing to support R&D, research and development, and that's one particular type of policy. When something has become developed enough that it can be deployed, but it's still expensive to deploy, then at that stage you need the types of policies. For instance, with solar and wind, feed-in tariffs kind of helped grow that deployment. That drove down costs due to kind of mass manufacture and further technological developments. And then later, when things have reached certain cost thresholds, they can be diffused further through the economy through policies like carbon pricing. And so smart policies and policy sequencing is very important. And the only legitimate way to have that is via the government legislative process.
To get to the second part of that question, but the system has removed it. But what I think it was asking is technology going to evolve more quickly than government can respond? And as a result, will progress be democratized? I think that was the broad thrust of it. Just a few quick thoughts on that.
A few quick thoughts. I mean, it's a question less of government, I think, but of society, because government is, in one sense, the collective brain of society, and so we have seen that possibility, and it's where those alignments we've spoken about become important. Now, some of those alignments are intentional; they're deliberate, but often they occur as a result of different agents in society responding to similar pressures and then finding themselves aligned. So the timing and encouraging those alignments is very important. So for a company, for example, like Shell, encouraging sectoral alignments between An example would be, is it called the Global Maritime Council, where you can have not only ship operators and shipbuilders, but ports, fuel suppliers like Shell, actually finding common ground and co-visioning what could be a lower carbon future for marine. So those alignments become very, very important in society to try and accelerate, to take advantage of those technical developments, which otherwise would remain limited in their application.
On, because we've got plenty of questions coming in. A comment from one viewer here who says, if I look on the most ambitious scenario, it seems to be far behind the Green Deal of the European Union. How does this fit, is the question.
Actually, we published in March last year a Europe climate neutral by 2050, which has been helpful within the European Commission and in our discussions with them about this. And so those kinds of developments are actually factored into how the European Green Deal is progressing as well. And what you find, of course, is that leading societies on decarbonisation will decarbonise as quickly as they can, and we see the increasing number of ambitions expressed towards decarbonising by 2050. And indeed, a company like our own is speaking of being a net zero emissions company by 2050. But there will be some lagging there. So the world overall will take a little longer. But still, if you are able to follow that accelerated pathway in Sky 1.5, you're able to limit global climate change to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century.
Okay, another good question here. This viewer points out that your team, Jeremy, sits within an oil and gas company, and therefore, doesn't this inevitably limit discussion and exploration of scenarios that could be quite unfavourable to a firm like Shell? It's a fair question.
It is a fair question, and indeed, first of all, I laugh because I don't actually think of Shell as an oil and gas company. I think of it as an energy service provider to 30 million retail customers every day and many businesses. And indeed, much of that service currently is because the end use needs are for oil and gas. So oil and gas is still a major part of that. Although we are one of the biggest renewable energy traders in North America, for example, the electricity trading and things like that. But it is a fair point. And I like to point out that my role is to speak truth to power to our executive committee and board, so that they're able to be stretched in their thinking, to be able to not just consider the extension of what is done today, but to consider what is good for society and hence good for business over the longer term as well. Some years ago, the head of our human relations in the company told me that I was a senior executive in the company, but in the senior executive grouping, I was tolerated but not embraced. And I feel that was the right position for somebody like myself. I have to be part of leading a team within the core strategy area of the company to stretch that thinking and to challenge that thinking.
Good to think of you, Jeremy, as an irritant for the top brass of the company. But look, I mean, you mentioned the executive committee. We have a number of questions coming in about Shell strategy, which the executive committee are setting. investment in oil and gas and all those kinds of things. You'll be aware that later this week on Thursday, we've got our annual strategy day so that we can share more information about the company's decisions for the future. In the light of that, can you talk about how the scenarios are used in Shell? I know you said that you speak truth to power, and that's one of your roles. But, for example, is Shell going to favour one of these scenarios, for example, the Sky 1.5 scenario, in its future investment policies? Is that how it's going to work?
Well, I think I hope that people really do pay attention to the strategy announcements that are coming on Thursday, and this type of work that I've been discussing has been the thinking that has helped set the context for making the choices the company is making. As I mentioned, I'm privileged to be part of the strategy leadership team of the company. We have to take choices in the light of all the different possibilities I've mentioned. But our CEO has been quite clear that for global society, in general terms, the accelerated decarbonization route is preferred. And so we can really only serve what our customers are demanding and needing. So we can only do that, but we can also help encourage customers along their pathway to cleaner technology use and decarbonization as well. So it's a mixed thing. For quite some time, people are going to need liquid and gaseous fuels. They need those kinds of portable thermal molecular fuels. And at this time, the bulk of those are oil and gas. And so there'll need to be continued investment in those areas. But there's also the pathway towards deeper electrification of the economy that I've featured in the scenario outlook. There's also the pathway towards the decarbonization of fuels, liquid fuels through biofuels, for example, gaseous fuels through hydrogen or hydrogen-based carriers. And so there's a lot of significance in really being able to be close to end use, close to customers, and collectively developing that kind of decarbonized future that benefits everybody.
Look, I can see from the clock that we've got just under quarter of an hour left. Still got plenty of time for your questions, but keep submitting them, please. Bottom right-hand corner of the screen is the yellow question bar. Having looked at the bigger context, let's get back into the detail of some of the scenarios, Jeremy, because one of the questions that's come in asks, do both waves and islands assume that national success is measured in GDP growth rather than evolving to a new metric?
It's a very interesting point, and I hope that people are able to take a look at the publication that we put on the web, the booklet itself, because it has actually a box on GDP growth and a number of quotes there, such as the quote from Bobby Kennedy about GDP measuring everything apart from what's really important to us. And so there is, of course, a movement in the world to try and broaden the metrics. And you've seen that over time with the Human Development Index from the United Nations. And you can see also the focus that the United Nations has placed on the Sustainable Development Goals and having individual goals on each of these areas. So it's not true that it's the only metric in the world, and neither should it be. Equally, it's the most accepted metric for productive activity in the world. And so there is still value in having that as an indicator, I think, and hence I've tended to express development in GDP type terms. But note, for example, in the waves outlook, surface GDP might be looking very good, but we've emphasized that that is on the surface of a layered economy, and there are currents underneath which are troubling as inequalities grow, as structural institutional development isn't being given the attention that it should do. So it's a good question, and it's a good area for people to keep, I think, thinking about and making progress in better ways. We assess the well-being of society.
Okay. So another comment here. They write, my 16-year-old daughter is watching this webinar with the viewer, with the commentator, and is apparently somewhat disturbed by the observation that people and policy only react to a crisis. So, Jeremy, have you been surprised as we've come through this global health crisis with COVID that green has actually been put at the heart of the policy agenda, or at least very near to the heart of the policy agenda?
Hello there. So it's nice that somebody, a teenager, is watching the webinar. I myself, my eldest grandson is a little bit young, but 15 years old, and is interested in these issues as well. And if it came across that I was saying people only react to crises, then that was unfair. What happens is that people can learn. They can learn from each other. They can learn from the past. But the behavioral economists have told us that one way of thinking of behavior sometimes is what you see is all there is. So people kind of get locked in a status quo type of thinking. So the thing that crises can do is actually unfreeze ways of thinking and enable developments to happen at a pace and a time that wouldn't happen in that stable course of things. So crises have a role to play in accelerating and galvanizing things as well. But indeed, from that learning, just to give an example, the September the 15th, 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed, and we had our recession and recovery scenarios. But people look back at that global financial crisis and have learnt lessons from, for example, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which has shown that smart investment in cleaner technologies, in greener areas, was actually very, very important and significant in generating jobs, i.e. re-stimulating the economy. And so people have learned from that. And I think that's one of the reasons that you're seeing, indeed, in various places, stimulus, including stimulus towards cleaner, greener investments.
Okay, so look, we've got 9.5 minutes left until the end of this part of the presentation. I've already reminded you how to submit a question, but just a reminder that there are some breakout sessions at the end of this for those of you who have registered. At the end of this question and answer session, we'll give you the details of how to join those. Next question for you, Jeremy. And they ask, with these three scenarios in mind, what signposts do you recommend to keep an eye on towards 2025? So looking maybe at the US and North America, or in Europe, or maybe in China or Asia more widely.
So indeed, that's a good point. So one can look at, I think, three things. One is the current state of policy and intention now as it's expressed. And the current state of deployment of cleaner technologies. That kind of gives you a snapshot starting point. Then you can look at what is happening with policy ambitions. Are you seeing indeed stronger decarbonisation ambitions, but also are you seeing evidence of policy nationalism in trade and things like that, which would be a signal towards a more islands type world. And thirdly, you can follow the surveys of social sentiment as well. and we've been following, indeed, generating with a surveying firm extra questions to get insight into that area. And just to give you a very brief snapshot of the kinds of things we're learning from that social area, is that the attention to issues related to both, if you like, or all of wealth, health, and security has increased during the course of COVID. So that kind of validates our sense that those are three useful things to think about when thinking about recovery. It has all increased. In the period from the beginning of the pandemic through to the mid of it, when there was the last survey was done, there was actually more evidence of islands type of mentality taking hold, which is something for us to be both aware of and hopefully to resist, because over the longer term, the islands type mentality leads to outcomes that kind of most people would find troubling. But we're still in the midst of the pandemic, and the crisis can play out in different ways. But I think if you look at those, if you look at the policy ambitions in particular areas and social surveys and developments are things to look at, but also kind of leadership. You think of the recent US election, and you've had a relatively minor shift in social sentiment. There's still relatively even balance of voters in the US, but you've got a different leadership now, which has placed much more attention on rejoining the Paris climate process, on the types of cleaner technology investments. So leadership plays a role, but only in that broader context of society.
So we've been discussing the US just now, Europe and Asia before that. Could you talk a bit more about the relationships between those big geopolitical entities? So, the USA, Europe, China, in each of these scenarios, and whether the rest of the world is going to be able to catch up with these big playmakers in the energy transition.
Well, it's good that you mentioned that there are big playmakers, and there's a handful of actors. Although ultimately this encompasses all of society, but just in geopolitical terms, and there is some deeper analysis of this in the publication that I mentioned. The two great economies, the two biggest economies in the world are, of course, the United States and China, and they have been having a troubled relationship over the past few years. But we shouldn't necessarily just think of these as one-dimensional relationships. It's a multiplex of relationships in which you can have a confrontation in some areas, you can have cooperation in others, you can have different relationships there, and those are seen in the different scenarios. So in the island scenario, it's a lot of confrontation around trade, and globalization and global trade is being reduced. Whereas if you look at the Sky 1.5 scenario, you see a recognition actually as both the great economies are looking to take domestic industrial and technological competitive advantage by advancing clean technologies. So they're getting aligned in those areas and see the value of supporting processes like the Paris process to give a global context for that. And so you're seeing different elements of that multiplex relationship in the different scenarios. And all of those elements are plausible.
Okay, look, we are gradually running out of time. We've got one more question, might have time for two, but let's press on. In all of these scenarios, climate change gets far worse, well beyond what the climate emergency position proposes to be unsustainable. Is this a conclusion that what Greta Thunberg wants will not or cannot take place?
Well, I think that the boundary that the real scientific experts have noted is that stretched Paris ambition of 1.5 degrees, and Sky 1.5 meets that boundary by the end of the century, and so that's kind of a positive, optimistic message that can be done. But it takes a huge amount to do that. Let me just kind of put that into context. We're currently at just about 1.2 degrees above the pre-industrial average. So 1.2, that leaves us with kind of like zero point 0.3 left towards that 1.5. And at current rate of emissions, we're actually increasing that temperature by 0.2 degrees every decade. So that would say there's a decade and a half, there's 15 years left to hit that limit. And if you think of any, for instance, new car coming on the road today somewhere in the world, somebody in the world is going to be driving that car still probably in 15 years' time. We're at that level of being close to those limits. And it's why the work of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which looks at mathematically plausible and other plausible routes towards decarbonising in future, has a number of routes like Sky 1.5, which are overshoot routes, which say you actually go above 1.5 degrees a little, and then through being able to draw down greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere can bring that back to that 1.5 degrees as well. The important thing is that for limiting the impact of greenhouse gas emissions, it requires really, really deep acceleration now and taking those choices now.
Okay, Jeremy, thank you very much. That was a fascinating discussion. So as I was saying earlier, this part of the presentation is now finished, but some of you have registered to join the breakout sessions. If so, please stay online. You'll be automatically redirected to the breakout room in Microsoft Teams, and those sessions will start in about 5 minutes. If you want more information on the scenarios, go to the website. I'll give you the address now, www.shell.com/transformation scenarios. That's /transformation scenarios. Other than that, thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it interesting and illuminating and enjoyable. But from Jeremy and from me, thank you very much and goodbye.